Okay, welcome back. I've entitled this episode Stoics, Sceptics and Epicureans, and it's going to deal with the three main schools of philosophy that emerged after the conquests of Alexander the Great. Remember, we ended last episode with Alexander's death in 323 BC. Now, traditionally, the period after the death of Alexander is viewed as a period of decline in philosophy, and I think it's important that we qualify this. In terms of actual discovery of knowledge as a whole, it did not mark the end of discoveries of new knowledge. You had many of the greatest Greek thinkers still to come, such as Euclid, who was born in 323 BC. He went on to systematise mathematics in his elements, and Archimedes, who was born in 287 BC. He did great work on the displacement of water and other physics problems. So it didn't represent the end of knowledge, but what it did represent was sort of a shift from ethics on the political stage in the form of the city-state, which had been rendered obsolescent by the establishment of the Greek Empire, to ethics on a personal level. And it's ethics on a personal level that tie all these three schools of thought, the Stoics, the Sceptics and the Epicureans, all together. So moving on to the first school I'm going to deal with, that is the Stoics. I think it's best if we take a few steps back and consider their precursors, the Cynics. So you remember in an early episode I discussed the philosopher Socrates. Now, Socrates, as well as having Plato as a pupil, had Antisthenes, who was another pupil. And Antisthenes was in general quite a conventional member of the Greek aristocracy until shortly after the death of Socrates, where he left the aristocracy and began to work out in the fields amongst the labourers. And he was trying to live a life based on virtue. So you can imagine him sort of as this monk-like figure, as obviously very controversial amongst the Greek aristocracy at the time. Now, Greece being a fairly small place, word got round to another man called Diogenes. And Diogenes came up to Antisthenes and tried to learn off him, but Antisthenes wasn't having any of this. He thought he had nothing to teach, so he beat Diogenes and tried to send him on his way. But Diogenes came back. Now, Diogenes was hanging around Antisthenes, and he was living in poverty. He was living without material possessions, with very little simple food, and he was sleeping in a large amphora, or a Greek pot. So he was living like a dog, basically, and that's what cynic means. It's related to the Latin word canine. But living like a dog and being indifferent to things proved to have great power as an ethic. Diogenes met Alexander the Great at one point, after Alexander heard a lot about the way Diogenes was living. And Alexander said to Diogenes, you're a famous man, is there anything that I can do for you? And Diogenes simply sat where he was and said, just stay out of my light. Now, Alexander laughed quite a bit at this, because it was obvious that Diogenes wasn't afraid of the most powerful man in the world at that time, and therefore he recognised that there was a certain power in this ethic or indifference that even he couldn't conquer. And this sort of powerful ethic fed into Stoicism, which is what I'm going to deal with now. Now, Zeno, who was born in around 325 BC, so shortly before the death of Alexander, was recognised as the first Stoic. And Stoicism is very big on ethics, but it's important to understand their conception of the universe before we get on to their ethics, because it feeds into it quite well. So, the Stoics had a pantheistic concept of the universe. Now, pantheism is this idea that the divine is in all. I think that's the easiest way to phrase it, because if I say God is in all, people's brains are so filled with a sort of almost anthropomorphic concept of God, like a guy with a big bushy beard, that it's going to give you the wrong idea. And I'm also going to change some of the terms slightly so to better convey the way that the Greeks would have thought. So they had this idea of nature as a category of the whole, and it was divided into two parts. The first part was matter, but then you also had this logos, which is a sort of an animating principle of the world as a whole. And so you ended up with a relatively deterministic universe governed by this logos, which is sort of abstract principles. However, every human had a spark of this divine fire or logos inside them, and that gave them free will. So you have this sort of distinction between a universe that's mechanically set up, but yet people have a choice. And then that leads on to the ethics in terms of what people should do with this choice. And the Stoics' answer would have been to pursue virtue. The Stoics believed in 4 virtues that are derived from Plato's Republic. That's wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. And they would argue that virtues are a good in themselves. It's not necessarily that you will improve people's lives by doing these things. It's simply because they're good in themselves that you should do them. The Stoics also held that because of this contrast, the rest of the world only had power to affect the externals, and through logic and reflection, an individual could obtain mastery over themselves. In the words of the Victorian poet in Invictus, "I am the captain of my ship, I am the master of my soul." So this sense of being indifferent to fear of death, to hot or cold, came from the Cynics, but was refined by the Stoics into a sort of useful ethic for everyday life. Now, there are several other famous Stoics, such as Chrysippus, who authored many books, including a few on propositional logic, which I'm not going to be able to go into here. I'll try to come back when I deal with 19th century logic at a later stage. But I'd like to move on to the Romans, who were also heavily influenced by Stoic philosophy. So you had Seneca, who had been the teacher of the Emperor Nero, and it's rumoured that Seneca attempted to orchestrate a plot to assassinate Nero. Now, when Nero found out about this, he gave Seneca a choice, which was either to commit suicide or to be killed, and Seneca chose to commit suicide, which shows sort of the self-mastery of the Stoics was not even fear of death. And then another idea which is important is the fact that this divine spark of the Logos meant that everyone in effect was related. So you had Epictetus the slave and Marcus Aurelius, who was an emperor, both espousing the Stoic philosophy and viewing themselves as citizens of the universe or sons of the divine. So in a way, Stoicism was a very unifying philosophy, and you could see almost in it a reflection of the sort of cosmopolitan character that Alexander had tried to bring about to hold his empire together. So that sums up Stoicism, this sort of ethic of self-mastery, reflection, and indifference to the external world. And I'll go on in the next episode to talk about the other 2 schools of Scepticism and Epicureanism.